Very inspiring words from Michael. Thank you so much. How about another round of applause for Michael Hagstrom? I have the honor and privilege of introducing you to our keynote speaker this morning, Jim Quigley. Jim is the CEO Emeritus of Deloitte and a member of the board, Audit Committee Chair, Risk Committee, and Credit Committee of Wells Fargo Company. Now, prior to retiring in June of 2012, Mr. Quigley served as Chief Executive Officer of Deloitte Touche Tohmatsu Limited, which is commonly known as DTL, the Deloitte Global Network, from 2007 to 2011, and as Chief Executive Officer of Deloitte LLP, the U.S. member firm of DTL, from 2003 until 2007. He served as a trustee of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation from 2012 until December of 2017. Mr. Quigley also is chairman of the board of directors of Hess Corporation and a member of the board of directors of Merrimack Pharmaceuticals Incorporated. He previously was co-chairman of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, a member of the board of the trustees of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, a director of the Center for Audit Quality, a trustee of the Financial Accounting Foundation, a member of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission Advisory Committee on Improvements to Financial Reporting, and a member of numerous committees of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. He is a busy guy. Mr. Quigley earned a Bachelor of Science degree and an honorary doctorate of business from Utah State University and Bentley College. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jim Quigley.
Well, Karen, thank you. That was a mouthful, probably exceeded any of your appetite. But my late mother would have been pleased that she went through that long list. I was told that this audience would be interested in a governance perspective on the work and communications of risk professionals and how those communications are perceived and received in the boardroom. And so let me just try to quickly chase that away and then try to do it in a way that you'll view as being authentic. And that is simply to say, I believe the work of risk professionals is essential to a board being able to honor and complete the commitments that are made to shareholders. And I'll illustrate that point by simply reading the purpose paragraph from the charter of a risk committee that I know quite well. And I quote, "The purpose of the risk committee is to assist the board of directors in fulfilling its responsibilities to oversee the company's enterprise-wide risk management framework and corporate risk function, including the strategies, policies, procedures, processes, and systems established by management to identify, assess, measure, monitor, and manage the major risks facing the company, including compliance risk, which includes conduct risk and financial crimes risk, credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, market risk, model risk, operational risk, which includes information security and cybersecurity risk, and technology risk, reputation risk, and strategic risk." How about that? Anybody want to sign up for that? There's only a few million shareholders you're making those commitments to, and there's some other pretty big stakeholders also where those commitments find their way. And so now I simply ask, could you imagine trying to accomplish that purpose without chief risk officers, chief compliance officers, chief audit executives, chief information security officers, and their teams? Obviously, it could not be done, and thus my thesis: directors love this group of professionals and absolutely could not perform our role without excellence from all of you. Your role, your work, your communications are absolutely core to enabling a board to perform its oversight role. Thank you for that commitment. And on behalf of your boards, thank you for your passion to perform your role and to do it with excellence. Each time a stakeholder is surprised or disappointed, a series of probing questions will be asked. For most of my professional life, especially my tenure as an audit partner at Deloitte, I believed any time there was a failure in financial reporting, the question was always asked, where were the auditors? In my current chapter of life, as a member of the boards of directors of public companies, I choose to believe that surprised or disappointed stakeholders are asking, where was the board? Or where was the risk committee of the board? And perhaps board members are asking, where was the chief risk officer, our chief compliance officer, our chief internal auditor, and their respective teams? In reality, I believe the seat we occupy can and should feel like the hot seat. And so the question of the day is always, how can we prepare for and manage known risks? I was encouraged to share my point of view on a framework for risk of the known and unknowns. So if you could put up that first slide for me, I would be grateful. Thank you. I don't recognize that slide, but I'm sure it's fine. Ah, that one I do recognize. Perhaps you might think it's less fine, but nevertheless. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld used this known unknowns language to attempt to explain the difficult to explain. And perhaps board members can approach risk management, and this can help us illuminate with using this framework in just simply a classic 2x2 matrix. So known knowns, things we know, that knowledge, and that classic line that we've always heard, whenever you see a 2x2 matrix, everybody wants to say, let's move things up and to the right. And then perhaps those known unknowns, maybe we can just simply brand that cell as simply identified risk. And unknown knowns, maybe that's just simply untapped knowledge. And then, of course, the unknown unknowns, that unidentified risk that is very hard for all of us to try to get our mind around, and in particular to try to figure out, is there a way for us to try to manage our way through that process? It's obviously comfortable to live in that upper right-hand box, and it would be terrific to be able to do board oversight from that upper right-hand box. But we all know that business decisions are often made, and frankly required to be made, when we don't have all of the information. And we have to be able to deal with uncertainty at some level. And therefore risk enters the equation and enters our conversation. We know business models are built and risk is priced, and then companies work hard to be able to manage risk inside of one of those frameworks. And we work hard to create risk management frameworks that address how much is enough. And then we work hard to develop thoughtful approaches to measure and dimension risk into a structured risk appetite. As a member of a risk committee, where should my emotion be? With a risk avoidance bias? Never be content until we have driven risk to zero? And if you can become comfortable with the risk framework, how can I provide active and effective oversight of the risk management processes and have confidence that assumed risk is staying inside of a risk appetite? And what are the standards for risk management? And can a risk committee look for third-party assurance on risk management? As the chairman of an audit committee, I know exactly what I'm going to receive when I am receiving a report related to internal control over financial reporting. I know the standards that are used by management to assess and monitor controls. I know the standards that are used by external auditors as they perform assurance through an integrated audit process. And if a significant deficiency or material weakness is identified in internal controls over financial reporting, I know what the standards require. Control, design, and monitoring, certifications from CFOs and CEOs in the post-Sarbanes-Oxley world, all enabled by a roll-up of certifications from business units, and then disclosure committees working to manage the judgments required in external financial reporting. We know how to do this, and we do it well. At a recent meeting of our risk committee, I asked if there was a body of standards independently developed and widely accepted to judge what is required for an adequate risk management system. I was told risk management was much more dynamic and challenging and broader than internal control over financial reporting, and that risk management was impacted by a constantly evolving set of products, customers, systems, and exposures. As risk managers, your job is hard, and the standards by which you are judged continue to evolve and be influenced by practices of your peers. And so I applaud gatherings like this, where you can exchange views with one another and learn from one another and influence how practice is actually being performed. For me, as a member of a board and its risk or audit committee, effective risk management is essential. And the work of the Chief Risk Officer, Chief Compliance Officer, Chief Internal Auditor are absolutely critical. I need and must have confidence in those individuals, but beyond that, I'm keenly interested in the risk culture of the enterprise and the behavior and thinking of professionals on the front line. Let me illustrate how important I believe culture is from the dimension of safety and risk that shapes how all players are required to conduct themselves at Hess, an oil and gas exploration and production company where I'm the non-executive chairman of the board. On Wednesday this week, when we convene our annual meeting in Houston, it'll be a room perhaps about this size, perhaps about this number of people in the room. After I say welcome to the shareholders, the very next person on the stage is going to be our Vice President of Environmental Health and Safety. And what Alex will do is he'll put up 2 slides. And the first slide will simply illustrate and describe, if we have an emergency, how we will evacuate the room and the building. And then the second slide will show where we will go to muster after we have exited that building. And that safety-first culture that will be evident at our annual meeting finds its way everywhere you go at Hess. If you go to board a helicopter in New Orleans to go out into the Gulf to a drilling ship or a production platform, you will go through a safety briefing before you get on the helicopter. As soon as that helicopter lands on the ship or production platform, you go immediately to the briefing room for equipment and a safety explanation of how you are to move around the platform or move around the ship, and what the yellow lines on the deck mean, and what the red lines on the deck mean, and where you cannot go. And you'll be explained, if you want to, as you're ascending or descending stairs, how you will always maintain 3 points of contact and what those handrails on the stairs are for, and that you are to use them. And you'll have your safety glasses, and you'll have your helmet, and you'll have your gloves. But safety is absolutely, and risk management is absolutely core to the culture of that enterprise, and I'm proud of that. And when you think about the risks associated with energy, exploration, and production, your mind perhaps will return to the Deepwater Horizons and the Macondo incident in the Gulf almost a decade ago now. And you will remember there were 11 lives lost on that platform. And there was also a horrific oil spill. And you will remember reading that BP's payment for reparation has exceeded $70 billion. Now, if you're the non-executive chairman of the board of an energy and production company with a market cap of slightly more than $20 billion, then you can think about offshore exploration as an existential risk. So as the chairman of the board, when you see this overt, pervasive commitment to safety and risk management, you'll feel good about that. And you'll like the fact that that is driven very, very deeply in the culture. And on Thursday, when I go to North Dakota and I am doing my site visit of the onshore exploration platforms, you're going to see exactly the same passion and commitment and depth to safety and risk, and how that is deeply embedded in the culture, and how it absolutely influences the behavior of every Hess employee. And when you are on a drilling ship or a production platform or a drilling rig in the Dakotas, you will observe that the number of Hess employees is probably way less than half or 25% of the people on the site. And then you will watch the third parties go through exactly the same commitment to Hess safety and culture. And that notion of risk management, deeply embedded then in the culture, finds its way into the boardroom. And when the president stands in front of us on Tuesday, tomorrow, and is making his presentation on operations for the quarter, the very first slide that goes up are the EH&S statistics. And he then tells you if we've had any recordable incidents, and if we've had any severe safety instances, and if we've had any releases. And then we put up the very next slide. How does that track with respect to our history? And how does it compare with respect to our peers? And into our incentive compensation plan, 10 to 20% of the executive's compensation is absolutely driven by those safety statistics. And it's not just true at Hess. I think it's true for every exploration and production company. But culture, my point, has to become fundamental and core to safety and risk. And I believe that culture also then has to be able to enter into the conversation with respect to risk management broadly in any industry. Could you bounce to the second slide, please? I know many of you are in financial services. This was my effort at trying to articulate what does the risk appetite look like. We know we can't live in that upper right-hand box for every business judgment that's made. And I couldn't figure out how to try to demonstrate that maybe in that unidentified risk we have some appetite for it. So I chose not to provide any shading there. But now when you decide that you can articulate a risk appetite, then how do you go about making sure that you consistently operate inside of that space? And can you, again, continue to move risk up and to the right? And can you help a board member have an understanding of our ability to track, monitor, measure, and actually keep track of our operations and make sure that they're staying inside of that risk appetite? Let me just make a couple of comments related to financial services. I know that many of you, your value proposition is focused in financial services. I appreciate Michael's earlier comments. I loved his passion. I loved his passion about purpose, and I loved the noble goals that the organization is working to try to accomplish. But in this known, unknown space, that identified risk, let's just think about for just a moment credit risk. It's easy for us to get our mind around. There's nothing particularly complicated about it. As a member of a credit committee, I know that not every loan Wells Fargo makes is going to be collected. I know that not every charge that's made on a credit card that we are issuing is in fact going to be paid. But then how do you stay inside that risk appetite? Each month I receive a credit report. It highlights the past due volumes. It highlights the volume of non-accrual loans. It highlights what has been charged off and how those trends and percentages track with our history and also our industry. And as the chairman of the Audit and Examination Committee, every quarter our allowance for credit losses is reviewed, and that significant management judgment and estimate that's part of preparing financial statements, we ask probing questions and want to really be able to provide that credible challenge and understand. And I know, because I've had the privilege of being there for 5 years, that our risk culture is sound and that our credit underwriters are well trained and that the delegation of authority is clear and that all of the committees in that chain are effective and that we have accountability in place. And now let's shift to compliance risk. Remember my earlier quest for standards for risk management. For a regulated national bank, let's accept the heightened standards in the Federal Register that have been published in the Federal Register by the Comptroller of the Currency, and let's just simply call those the standards. And then we're all familiar with them. Using the Comptroller's language, all 3 lines of defense. First, the roles and responsibilities of the front line. Frontline units should take responsibility and be held accountable by the Chief Executive Officer and the Board of Directors for appropriately assessing and effectively managing all risks associated with their activities. Second, roles and responsibilities of independent risk management. Independent risk management should oversee the covered bank's risk-taking activities and assess risks and issues independent of the front line. And then a relatively long list of here are the things that they would like independent risk management to do. Quoting in part, communicate to the risk committee instances when there are differences in frontline assessment of risk and differences in assessment from the third line of defense. Escalate if any instances of differences in risk from the CEO's assessment. And then finally, develop, attract, and retain professionals. And then for the third line, a very long list, but let me just read one of those items that I think is very challenging for a audit committee, I think very challenging for a risk committee, and I think very challenging for chief internal auditors as well. The reports, meaning the reports that audit provides to an audit committee, should identify the root cause of any material issue and include, 1, a determination of whether the root cause creates an issue that has an impact on one organization unit or multiple organization units within the covered bank, and 2, a determination of the effectiveness of frontline units and independent risk management in identifying and resolving issues in a timely manner. Easy to write, super hard to do. And then the risk appetite. A covered bank should have a comprehensive written statement that articulates the covered bank's risk appetite and serves as a roadmap for managing risk across the enterprise. And then I love this language, proactive oversight of management. A covered bank's board of directors, lovely people, by the way, really, truly lovely people, should actively oversee the covered bank's risk-taking activities and hold management accountable for adhering to the risk governance framework. In providing active oversight, the board of directors may rely on risk assessments and reports prepared by independent risk management and internal audit to support the board's ability to question, challenge, and when necessary, oppose recommendations and decisions made by management that could cause the covered bank's risk profile to exceed its risk appetite or jeopardize the safety and soundness of the covered bank. Sounds pretty easy, right? I think being on the board of a regulated bank is not for sissies. I'm the chairman of the compliance subcommittee of the Wells Fargo Risk Committee. I have huge respect for and work closely with our Chief Compliance Officer, Mike Romer. And let me quote a recent article in which Mike was interviewed. This was in Compliance Week. I I think just published last week or perhaps the week before, I'm not sure. And I think we're making great progress with respect to compliance on our compliance risk journey as we're seeking to achieve and then be in compliance with the OCC's heightened standards. Quoting Mike on the culture dimension, remember my earlier comments about culture that I was trying to drive home as the chairman of the board of an oil and gas production company. Quoting Mike, "For me, the biggest driver of culture in any organization is observable behavior. A compliance function should be and can be a culture carrier for the organization. It can be a champion for the culture of the organization." And remember the OCC heightened standards for independent risk management, where they said you need to develop, attract, and retain professionals. Quoting Mike, and I've heard him say this many times when he and I have been together with our regulators on our regular visits to Washington, but now quoting Mike, "When I started at the top of the house, there was approximately 200 compliance colleagues. Then there were compliance colleagues embedded throughout the company in the frontline business units. Today, we have 4,300 compliance personnel that all report up to the Chief Compliance Officer at the enterprise level. We not only identified people performing compliance in the businesses and centralized them, we also hired more than 500 people over the last 10 to 14 months. As the chairman of the compliance subcommittee of the risk committee, I can provide active oversight of compliance through my regular contact with Mike and supporting him if ever a budget battle were to exist. Remember that lower right-hand box, that thing that we called Untapped Knowledge? When I looked at that, I thought of the old interviews at General Motors when they were working to try to compete with the ever-present European vehicles and the growing, impressive Japanese presence. And it was suggested that we don't really need to try to get all of the General Motors plants to behave like a BMW plant or look like a Toyota plant. What if we could get all of the General Motors plants to be as good as the best General Motors plant? And then what would that enterprise look like and its performance? But when we think about what the organization knows, but yet at various levels of the organization, that is untapped knowledge, there's certainly great opportunity here. Great opportunity through how ethics lines are used. Great opportunity to really leverage what we know from customer complaints. And again, from my friend Mike Romer, I quote, "We want people to raise their hand and identify problems as quickly as possible, but we don't necessarily want them to fix them on their own. No one, including me, Mike Romer in this case, is successful on their own. You only are successful when there is a team effort. I can build a great compliance function in and of itself, but if it doesn't engage with the businesses and doesn't engage with the rest of the risk ecosystem of the firm, we won't be successful. We might have pockets of success, but you can't be truly compliant if the rest of the firm is having issues and customers are not having good experiences." Remember the OCC standard of second line of defense communicating to the board of directors when their assessment differs from the first line or the third line. I have every month, and sometimes more frequent than that, one-on-one conversations with Mike. We do that as part of our regular process for preparing for our risk compliance subcommittee meetings. And I also have the opportunity then to ask, and he has the opportunity to escalate if there's anything that he is unhappy about. And I'm pleased with those communications, and it is an important part of how I perform my role. And then as Mike reports to our full committee, we have the opportunity to hear directly from him risks that he is concerned about, and we have the opportunity to understand the action that is being taken and the progress that's being made. Are we where we want to be? Absolutely not. Are we making progress? Indeed, and in my view, impressively so, our ambition can be zero defects, i.e. perfection. And while we may want that aim, at a minimum, are we driving to be consistently inside the risk appetite that we have assumed? When we have an issue, we want to have that issue self-identified. We want to do the root cause analysis, take corrective action, and if any customer harm, remediate. We know the world of our ambition, and we're working in a collaborative manner with our risk team to drive towards that goal. Thank you very much. I appreciate the privilege of exchanging a few views with you and at least sharing my point of view with this audience. And I repeat what I said at the beginning. From the board seat, we love you guys, and there is no way we could provide effective oversight of these enterprises without excellence from all of you. So thank you, and thank you for convening and being committed to continue to enhance all that you do. Thank you very much.